I'll introduce myself, I suppose, to start with. So I'm Professor Andrew McCain from Victoria University. I'm the editor-in-chief of Advanced Exercise and Health Science journal, which we launched this time last year. This is a peer-reviewed publication, which has been established and sponsored by Women's Sports University. And the
Recording in
research
progress.
And the research encompassed by the journal include exercise and health science with a particular emphasis on multidisciplinary research with various health conditions and the use of exercise and sport as an intervention. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Remco Polman, who's currently the Pro Vice Chancellor Research and Executive Dean for the Institute of Health and Wellbeing at Federation University. I've known Remco for nearly 15 years, since he was appointed at Victoria University. And then following his appointment there, he was head of psychology and Dartmouth Department of Bournemouth University in UK. And then following that, he decided to come back to Australia again and as head of School of Exercise and Nutrition Science at QUT for a 5-year period before taking up his current role at Federation University. Remco is a chartered psychologist by the British Psychology Society and an accredited sport and exercise psychologist by the Healthcare and Professions Council in the UK and a fellow of the European College of Sport Science. Remco's research interests are quite diverse and include stress, coping and emotions in sport and exercise, the psychology of sport and injury rehabilitation, personality and sport and exercise and mental toughness, and exercise psychology, aging, sports coaching, and science in esports. Professor Pullman has published around 200 manuscripts, peer-reviewed manuscripts, with a H index of around 77, and has been the top 2% of cited authors in the world. Professor Pullman is presenting on his topic, The New Frontiers for Exercise Science, Performance and Wellbeing in Esport Athletes. Professor Pullman will present for the next 45 minutes or so. If you've got any questions throughout, we'll address at the end, or if you can put them in the chat, happy to have a look at them. Thank you, Remco.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for inviting me to this forum. This, as you say, forum number 16, and as Andrew mentioned, one of my interests is in the science of esports, and with some colleagues we recently published a book on that. It's one of the first ones in the area. I first want to start some of my inroads in how I actually got involved in esport. What you might find out later is that, considering my age, it's probably not that common for people like me to actually get involved in esports. It tends to be more related to younger people. But at an event when I was working at QUT, I was chatting with Dylan Poulis and Michael Trotter, and they told me everything about esports, and they were very keen to sort of get engaged in some research in the area. And about 5-6 months later, they actually signed up to do a PhD in the area. This was around 2018. So, and they were sort of the first people to work with, and we sort of got our first publication out in that year as well. So Dylan is currently actually seconded to Movember and works at Southern Cross University, and Michael is based in Sweden at Halmstad University. I would like to mention some other people I've been working with in this space. Kabir Bubna, Andrew Kitkev, and who's currently a PhD student at QUT, Craig McNulty, who's a staff member there, Matthew Watson, who's with the International Federation of Esport Coaches, Rebecca Wong, an ex-PhD student of mine, now a private practitioner, Tristan Coulter, and Carl Bennett, who's at Southern Cross. You might think, why is esport important for exercise and health science? So I tried to make this point during this talk. But first, I also want to say something about why we should actually look at esport and the growth of esport over the last decade or so. I presented some data on this in terms of the growth and the impact of esport across the globe. I mean, this is the study done on the sort of the number of publications in esports. It was done in 2021, so unfortunately there is no, to my knowledge, a more recent one, but it shows you the increase in publications in the area. I mean, quite a steep increase, and I would like to think that the increase is more and more over the last few years. Also interesting to see in that same paper was the kind of journals that people published in. So if you can look at the titles of some of them, quite a few of them were actually related to computer science or computer science and human behavior. I mean, looking at the titles of this, you can see there's a diverse range of topics within esports, and that's actually also reflected when you look at sport and exercise sciences, areas like sport management and sport history, etc. So, but since that time, there have been also some more esport related journals established. This all sort of happened around 22. So just like the Journal of Electronic Gaming and Esports and the International Journal of Esports came about. The work I've been doing with my colleagues has been published in actually the mainstream sports science and sports psychology journals. And actually, we've been quite successful, and a lot of the papers are actually being highly cited. So it is important for journals these days. And it's probably to do also with the type of work we've been doing. We've been more focused on actually performance, how we can enhance performance of esport athletes, and some of them also related to the health outcomes related to esports. So it's important for the journal to actually look at esport as a vehicle to enhance health as well. One of my big gripes actually in the esport literature at the moment is that there seem to be a lot of reviews published, but there's a lack of empirical studies, and we really need to enhance that. I will just briefly sort of allude to the incredible increase of esport and its impact. So when esport is on the rise in terms of people who participate in it, the number of people watching it, as well as the revenue generated by it. There are highly lucrative competitions these days for many esports, and several esport events were actually part of the Olympic esports series during the 2024 Paris Olympic Games. So one of the prestigious events was the Esport World Cup, which offered the largest prize pool in esports, where cross-game competitions format was held for 8 weeks. And from this year onwards, Saudi Arabia will actually host the Olympic Esport Games for the first time. And this was endorsed by the 142nd International Olympic Community session in Paris. So there's a lot of things happening within the esport domain, and this is some information about what the leading games are at the moment. So you can see Dota 2, Counter-Strike, etc. So before we go further, there are some differences between the games. So, and what has happened is people categorize them into certain categories. So we have what's called first-person shooter games. Games like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike. We have multiplayer online battle arena games like Dota and League of Legends. And I have to say that most of my research has been actually done on those particular games. We have games which mimic the traditional sports like soccer, like FIFA Soccer. We have real-time strategy games, and we have the fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. This is slightly older slide. I couldn't find anything newer these days, but this is some of the prize money associated with esport games and traditional sport. And even and this is I think 2017 or 2018 at the latest, you can see that some of the prize monies for these competitions were similar or not higher to well-known international sporting events. But it shows that there's a lot of wealth going around within the esports community. I mean, esport is not the same consumed as traditional sport. So the biggest platform for people to actually watch and engage in esport is actually Twitch. I presume everybody online who's familiar with esport is familiar with the Twitch platform. Other platforms are YouTube and Facebook, but if you look at the percentage of people actually using those platforms, it's very minor compared to what's actually on Twitch. Twitch is really the main platform where things happen. And again, like some of the data here, again, a bit dated, but Twitch has really shown a significant increase in hours streamed, for example, from 12 to 16, or so, like a 250% increase. And I'm pretty sure that this is increasing a lot more. There are some more data, but unfortunately, they are sort of behind the paywall, and it's actually quite expensive to actually get to. So how many people actually consume esports? So this is more some recent data and sort of audience growth from 2020 to 25. And again, you can see that there's an incredible increase of people who are engaged in esport, either as an occasional viewer or people who are esport enthusiasts. So even for this year, the estimation that there will be 640.8 million people actually looking at this. And you see year on year, there's close to a 10% increase in people engaging in esport. It keeps on growing. And if you then compare it to some of the traditional sport, this is in particular American sports, you can see that the esport is like the green line here. It's for a particular age group, it's very similar to games like ice hockey or baseball. It's still slightly behind basketball, American football, but I said this data is slightly out of date, so I would like to think these days it's very similar. What is interesting to see though is like the age of the people who particularly engage with esports. So you see in particular between the age of 21 and 35, and this is all for males. Unfortunately, esport is still very much male dominated, although more females are engaging, but a lot of the data in the past were based on male participation and engagement with esport. And you see when you get to more like my age, then the level of engagement is a lot less. But you see that already in, I think, 220 data, that the level of esport engagement is very high. And what is happening is that people who engage with esport are actually substituting this with watching traditional sport. The more clear is here is to do with the age distribution. Is if you compare some traditional sports, and so these are Inter Milan, Bayer Leverkusen, and RB Leipzig. So they are well-known soccer teams in Europe. And you look at the age distribution compared to three esport teams. So you see, particularly, and you look at the orange aspect, you see that the age distribution for the esports are a lot younger compared to the traditional soccer clubs. So it's generally even the 30 to 23-year-olds which are engaged with the esports, whereas in soccer it's a more even distribution across the age, or more actually the middle-aged ones here. In terms of its revenues and growth, you can still see this is some predictions from for the next few years, and this is in billions of dollars. So there's this prediction that esport will just keep on growing, and more revenue will be available within in esport domains. And so the predictions from 23 to 25 are actually very accurate. So I'm pretty sure this growth will continue. And when you see where they actually get the money from, then this is not much different from traditional sport. So up to about 75% comes from sponsorship and advertising and media rights, and it's very similar within traditional sport. See, ticketing for events is only a small part of the income of esport. And this also happens in traditional sport these days. And if you look at the worth of some of the teams who play esports, then they are, oops.
可以，我向你咨询一下哟。马上打电话给我。对对。然后早上我来。
Sorry about that. So actually, the worth of some of the esport teams is incredible. So TSM is worth over 500 million. I can tell you that's a lot of money, and it's equitable to many of the famous soccer teams in Europe, for example. So the value of these teams is significant. So as mean, what this data shows is that the incredible growth and impact esport will have in the future. I suppose one of the more important questions here is esport actually sport? And there've been quite a few papers written on this, and people have discussed this quite extensively. The first thing I would like to say is that esport is not the same as gaming. So gaming is generally something you do in your leisure time, whereas esport is something where you basically pay for competition and for rankings. So they're definitely not the same, and it's also hard to compare some of the gaming research compared to the esport literature. I'll come back to that later. So the biggest difference between esports, gaming, and traditional sport is that one is taking place in the real world, while the other one is taking place in the virtual world. Although I'll come back to a bit later, so I think some of it might change as well. However, if you look at the way esports is organized compared to traditional sport, then there's a lot of aspects which is very similar these days. So this is like in terms of organized events like world championships or competitions, the live commentary, the live audiences. I mean, some of the esport events are placed in big venues. The broadcasting, although it might be on different platforms, it's all done live. Player awards, recruitment and contracts, sponsors, competitive environment, they are all very similar. As such, in my view, esports is a similar thing as sport, and I think there's a bit of consensus these days that this is the case, and the fact that the Olympic Committee has sort of endorsed esports is a testament to that as well. So the question then is, what do you call people who are playing esports? Do you call them gamers? Are they athletes? What is it like? So we actually wrote a paper in 2023 with and actually suggested that we should call people playing esports e-athletes. So they're basically athletes. And again, they're not the same as gamers. I do think that there is still this sort of social stigma around, and this idea of what an esport athlete or is actually look like. If you look at the picture on the top right, it is some basically fat bloke, and most of the time sitting behind a computer, drinking lots of fizzy drinks and eating too much chocolate and crisps. But really, that's a sort of out-fashioned idea. But I do think for that, particularly for adolescents and children, that it's difficult to sort of have that their parents probably have this idea about playing esports, but and get rid of that sort of social stigma in the future. So I would like to say that esport players are not physically unfit and unkept, young men in particular, but can also be young women as well. So it is actually important to be physically fit. And I mean, there's a lot of evidence that if you are fit, you're much better in what's called your executive function in your brain. So you can make quicker decisions, you can make better decisions. It's also better, for example, for your eye-hand coordination. Some research suggested esport athletes make 400 moves per minute on the keyboard or the mouse. That's an incredible amount of movement. I'm currently involved in some research where we're actually looking at the heart rate and the workload of e-athlete playing in competitions or actually doing training. And you can definitely see that the heart rate is increased doing both. Sometimes it's just difficult to see like what might be increased heart rate due to, for example, stress, and what might be part of the actual physicality of the activities itself. But in my view, people who play esports should be called e-athletes. The previous to how esport is defined, and again, there are many definitions in the literature. And I would say none is perfect. However, the one by Pedraza and Ramirez and Collins provide a good starting point. So their definition is electronic sports or esport is the term used to describe the casual or organized playing of video games in a way that provides professional or personal development to the player. So this definition provides a clear distinction between gaming and esport. Gaming is a leisure activity, whereas esport has this aspect of professional or personal development. So an important difference between gaming and esport is the notion that esport is played competitively for rankings and money, whereas gaming is no. So the next part of my presentation will be about esport performance and well-being. an important question is, so what are the factors actually associated with esport performance? So Nagoski and Wiemeyer proposed some of the factors based on their research on factors related to sport performance and game competencies, and came up with a list which is the middle part of this diagram. So tactical cognitive abilities, coordination skills, psychic abilities, social abilities, conditioning, and disposition, etc. I do think that this particular model doesn't really capture it all. One of my big issues with this model is that they use some terminology which is a bit inappropriate, like psychic abilities is not something we tend to use in the sport science or sport psychology literature. But that's some of the limitations. And I think if you look at the list of sort of, I came up with what might be related to this as well, there's quite a few of them. I mean, I don't want to go through all of them, but generally, if you're not in good general health, then you're never going to perform at the highest level. Things like obesity are associated with poor cognitive function, for example, poor executive functioning. Again, like fitness might be important in terms of preventing injuries. If you move 400 times per second, that's a lot per minute. Some other things from other movement skills to cognitive aspect, social. There might be a lot of genetic influences here as well. So, I mean, things like reaction times have been shown to have some genetic component to it, as well as visual acuity. So it might well be that there are some differences emerging between elite and non-elite players because of their genetic makeup. There's definitely economic differences in terms of the GDP, the IT infrastructure in countries and the population. So I'm based in Australia, and I can tell you that the IT infrastructure, in particular the internet, is not the best in the world. It tends to be pretty slow. Considering the lot of competition I've played internationally, that is a problem. Actually, it's a problem also because of time zones. Like if you play in competition in America, often things have to be done during the night. So that's not very conducive to playing as well. The nutrition aspect in terms of what we eat or drink. I mean, caffeine, for example, has definitely been shown to improve alertness. So how does it influence as well? I come back to psychological aspects, then there are coaching issues and the sport structure. We were actually awarded, Dylan Portis in particular was awarded a grant from the AAS to actually examine this. And we currently have a paper under review where we actually look at the structure for elite sport in so the top countries and some countries with sort of second tier ones. So hopefully we'll get that published soon, and that will deal with how we can, for example, ID talent and how can we train and help people to go to the elite level. But I will particularly going back to the psychological aspect, and that includes things like coping with stress, and that's one of my areas of expertise. So I've done lots of work on stress and coping in elite sport, and quite a bit of the research I've done in esport actually deals with a similar type of issues. And really, stress is what you think it is. That's the simple way of looking at it. So playing for 30,000 in front of 30,000 people might be stressful for some person, but a really exciting thing for another person. So it's your interpretation of how you think about what's in front of you. And if you look at it in a simple way, so there are stressors and it can be at different levels. So it could be you as an individual, or at the group level, or the team you're playing in. It could be the organization you work in, your esport team, but it can also do with extra organizations like your family, your how it's related to your work, etc. So the stressors which can relate to different part of your life. And then we have different outcomes. So you could have psychological ones, so that could be, for example, your level of state anxiety. Behavioral ones are to do with, like, for example, how smooth you can move, for example. The speed of your execution. So if you get stressed, you then see more core contraction of your muscles, which then results in slower movement and less refined movement as well. But of course, also lots of cognitive aspects to it. And one of the important ones are intrusive thoughts. So people keep on thinking over and over again of maybe mistakes they make. I mean, one of the first research I've been involved in is actually the concept of reinvestment. So there's actually people thinking about what they're doing. And so again, when people get under stress, they actually start thinking of how to execute a task. And when you do that, it becomes suddenly a lot harder. And there are physiological ones in terms of the cortisol response or even your breathing rate. So there's quite a few different kind of outcomes associated with it. What you also see is there are some differences between genders. Generally, there is some research suggesting that females experience more stress and higher intensity stress. There might be difference between sports, between the setting like competition versus training, the symptoms of stress, the frequency of how often you experience stress. And there are some tempo variations, but this is a sort of simplified way of looking at it. So important question to ask yourself is why should you actually do research on stress and coping? I mean, then you go back to the sport literature, and basically the failure to cope with stress results in decreased performance. And much of my research actually showed this. And it's possibly Lazarus, who's one of the most famous researchers in the area, which sort of first mentioned this. There are also problems with health and more likely to get injury. A lot of the models of how people get injured in sport are actually related to stress. So when people cannot deal with it, they're more likely to get injured. There's also then decreased satisfaction. So that's probably to do also with people's psychological well-being. People might withdraw from the activities, and overall, people can actually not pursue their career in professional sport or esports in this instance. So there's a lot of reasons why we should actually look at stress and coping in esports. So over my career, I've really made use of the model put forward by Lazarus and Folkman. So briefly try to explain what it means. It's a process model. So it's what happens is there's an important event you are engaged in. So there might be like an important competition. You then, as an individual, appraise the situation as either stressful or not. If there's no stress involved, then you actually don't have to do anything. But if you perceive it as being stressful, this might result in a number of situations. You can either see it as for example, a threat or a challenge. So, for example, you are the esport athlete. You would like a tennis player, and you have to play the number 100 in the world, and you have to play to number 1. You can either see it as a threat to yourself and you think you're going to lose, or you can see it as a challenge that you can learn from the situation. And actually that is quite a big distinction, a difference, because that results in different ways of how you should cope and kind of the outcomes associated with it. So after the appraisal, then you have to invoke coping strategies to deal with the stressor. And they can be classified into 3, what we call higher order coping dimensions. So problem focused, emotion focused, or avoidance coping. Following that, there's a particular outcome. You either succeed at dealing with it or you don't. And this has particular influences for your emotions and your performance. And then when it happens, you come to a new situation and the model goes round and round. And there are certain factors which actually influence this. So for example, I've done quite a bit of research that say personality has an influence of how you perceive events and what kind of coping strategies you use. So it is to do what we call the big 5 personality trait, but also a mental toughness, which is a more sport-related personality trait, as well as gender actually has an influence on this as well. And then there are social influences which also influences, so the social context itself, so the influence of peers, things like coping self-efficacy and the nature of the stressor. So within the sport context, I've shown that all these aspects actually play a role. It's a bit more fine-grained, but I think for the time being, this is probably a good way of understanding the stress and coping process. So one of our first studies was actually looking at the stressors esport athletes experience. So there was a study done with about 270 esport athletes, and we ranked them within the top 40% of their chosen esport. I mean, how we did this is a talk in itself, but because we had people from multiple sports or esports like Rainbow Six, Siege, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, League of Legends, and Defensive Agent. So you have to come up with a way of how you can actually classify people at the same level, because all the games have different ways of classifying the achievement level of their players. It's a bit like ELO rankings in chess, but they're all slightly different. And so we came up with a way of how we can actually classify them together. So what we did, we just asked the athletes or the esport athletes to list some stresses they experienced while playing their chosen esport. So what we actually found was that there were 4. So we compared the results to a paper I've been involved in 2007 with Adam Nichols. And so we actually identified 4 novel esport codes, which were not really provided in the previous sport literature. One was technical issues, and technical issues in the sense that to do with the equipment. And I suppose this is one of the big differences between playing sports in the virtual versus the non-virtual world. Another really important one was antisocial behavior of teammates, balancing life commitments and critical moment performance. So they were the sort of 4 different ones. And you looked at teammate and performance for making most of the higher order stresses for this group. And in particular, antisocial behavior was reported quite a bit. So that seems to be a particular issue in esports. That particular study only focused on this aspect of the model. It's actually quite hard to examine and measure all the aspects at the same time. So one way of doing it is actually through a diary studies. Again, like I've been involved quite a few of these diary studies within the sport domain, and we sort of apply this now to esport. So we basically had 6 elite League of Legends esport athletes complete the diaries over an 87-day period. So we measured stresses, the way they appraised it, their coping strategies, and how effective this was. So we had really good completion rate in terms of the diaries, over 80%, which is very good for these type of studies. And we collected data on solo training, team training, and when they had competitive matches. And again, like the number of observations are really good for diary studies. So in terms of what the diaries are based on, so the stressors, we provided like stressor categories people could tick and also could do new ones. It was based on the earlier research by Pulisadol. The stressor appraisal was based on our previous research, and coping was based on study done with Rebecca Wong in the past, and coping effectiveness I studied with myself a while ago. So it was all based on sort of quite solid measurements we've done before. What were the key findings of this study? And this is actually published in Psychology, Sport and Exercise, which it's good to know. This is probably the highest ranking sport and exercise psychology journal. So it's good to see that those kind of journals actually take these kind of papers. So again, if you look at the stressors, and this is what I refer to lower order strategies and higher order strategies. So these are more grouped together. So you see performance and teammates become the majority of stressors they experience. Again, like general performance as a lower order, the outcome, the critical moments, and a teammate make mistakes. So again, the teammate is a really important stressor for these players. Remember, League of Legends is a team game, so it's if this is a big issue, something has to be done. I thought briefly about that people can appraise a situation as a challenge or a threat. So, for example, if you see something as a challenge, you generally generate what's called positive emotions, where if it's a threat, you generally generate negative emotions. And negative emotions generally have consequences of how you cope and the outcomes. So actually the intensity of the stressor was associated with if people saw it as a challenge or a threat. So with the higher intensity, it's more likely to be a threat. Also, performance stressors are more likely seen as a challenge, where again, teammate stressors were seen as a threat. So they often experience teammate as a stressor, but also see it as a threat, which has this negative connotation. And if you look at what the kind of coping strategies they use, it mainly problem focus, some avoidance, and some emotions. What we need to say here is that problem focused coping is generally the most adaptive strategy we can use in dealing with stresses. And this is shown in sport as well as in general life. So problem-focused coping strategies really help you to solve the issue at hand and make sure it doesn't come back. Avoidance coping might be adaptive. However, what it generally doesn't do is actually solve the problem. So, for example, if you keep on making or having an argument with one of your teammates, and you try to avoid it, then that will still linger on, and at some point you will have to solve the problem. Otherwise, it will come back in the next situation again. An emotion-focused strategy tend to do with, like, for example, lowering your arousal levels, and sometimes they might be more adaptive as well. So if you're really under high stress, it's often quite difficult to think about ways to solve it. So by then reducing your arousal levels through, for example, deep breathing, it might be then better to invoke a problem coping strategy afterwards. And sort of, if you look at the effectiveness rating of these strategies, then you can see that these avoidance coping are not seen as effective as the problem and emotion focused, and particularly not for the teammate stressor. So what are the implications? So basically, esport athletes experience similar stressors as general or traditional sport athletes, and basically the sort of the aim of this kind of research is to find ways what stressors do people experience, what is the most effective way to deal with this. So from a practical perspective, what can you do about it? So one thing is what we call managed environmental social engineering. Just what we said before, teammate stress seems to be an issue. Particularly the elite esport teams tend to live together in one house and see each other a lot. So you wonder if this might be the best way of actually training and playing together all the time. Maybe it might be better for them to actually live in different places and actually go home after you train or play competition. So the way you actually organize your environment might be quite helpful in, for example, reducing the amount of stressors. I mean, the way we appraise stressors, like I said, challenge or threat, also is important. And there are what we call cognitive behavioral therapy strategies to actually change this. I haven't talked about it here, but we actually did also look at the influence of mental toughness on this. And what we find is that people who have higher level mental toughness use more adaptive coping strategies and actually are also more likely to be ranked higher as well. So people have suggested strategies of how you can actually enhance people's mental toughness. And one other way is to improve coping effectiveness. And actually, recently we completed a study where we tried to implement this. So we developed a coping effectiveness training and measured this influence on people's coping effectiveness, subjective performance, and their mental health. So that's the psychological distress and well-being, as well as their resilience. So we had 5 elite male League of Legends players competing in the Oceania circuit, and they participated in the study. So what we did, we used a within subject quasi-experimental design, and the players participated in basically 2 hours of coping effectiveness training and a 45-minute follow-up workshop. I'm not going into all the details, but if you look at the graph here, so this is the coping effectiveness. So what you see is that this is the pre-test, this is the post-test. So you see that people actually improve their coping effectiveness in the post-test. So during the season, this might actually have had quite a bit of effect on the stress experience. And actually, if you look at the subjective performance, it is quite increased at the post-test compared to the pre-test. The other ones are a bit less. Unfortunately, what we found is after the follow-up, the scores almost seem to come back to what it was at the pre-test. So what it shows is that you probably can do a coping effectiveness training, but you probably need to do some follow-up sessions to actually make this stick over time. But there seems to be promising results here to show that you can actually help players to cope more effective, and this might have influences on how they deal with these situations. One thing I would like to say is that what I said before is esport is not the same as gaming. Prior to get involved in esport, I did some work on video gaming, and so this is particularly associated with video game addiction. And so, for example, in this instance, video game addiction can actually result in negative mental health consequences, depression. And that's what we call a direct effect. And then coping can help you to sort of alleviate this, but ultimately, the people who video game too much get depressed. By the same token, video game engagement, and I hope like to think that a lot of people who play esport are more engaged than addicted. But you can actually see that people's coping repertoire can actually mediate the effect on a negative mental health or depression. So that would show that if you teach people appropriate coping strategies, then that might help them to avoid to get negative mental health consequences. And what we need to do is actually replicate this kind of studies within the esport domain, what's happening in gaming. I'll talk mainly about sort of a lot of the reasons we've done is it's to do with high performance esport. What I do think though is that grassroots esport actually has the biggest potential for improving health outcomes, and particularly in some groups of people we find hard to achieve in other interventions. We've done some work in schools already. Unfortunately, that was influenced by COVID, but we already saw some benefits of esport training on health and well-being. So my idea of some of the things that I really would like to pursue in the future is to see esport as a vehicle for public health and changing population measures in terms of health or cognitive functioning. So can we actually bring about health behavior change through people engaging in esport where you then use strategies to improve other behaviors? And this particular case would be particular case for young individuals, particularly young men and young women, teenagers, which are often not engaging in interventions in either the school or extracurricular settings. Give an example. So how can we, for example, improve physical activity in people who play esport? Often we think that they don't engage in enough physical activity at the same time because they sit and play games. So how can we actually do this? And we actually do know that people who sit too much are more likely to be obese and might not develop sufficient what we call fundamental movement skills. Again, obesity also has effects on your performance at school. Your academic performance is forward decrease, so has a reduction in fundamental movement skills. So if we can actually then link esports with increased physical activity or learning of fundamental movement skills, we can actually maybe change the health of these populations. And going back to the idea of the ancient Greeks, where it's basically the holistic development of body and mind. And we all know that in physically active lifestyle builds resilience to mental, social, and physical ill health. So just go to the particular aspect of esports and fundamental movement skills. Fundamental movement skills are these activities here. So what I see happening also in esports is that with the increase of what we call immersive environments like VR or even sensory technology, esports might actually start to get played quite differently. So rather than a keyboard or a mouse, we might actually stand in a cave like this where we actually have to move in order to actually play the game. Or we actually have sensor technology which can do this for us. So in that sense, esports might actually become more associated with moving ourselves. Most game designers of esports built in particular psychological principles to basically make people addicted to the game and play them even more. It's a bit like gambling. It's you have, for example, what we call reinforcement schedules to make people play as long as you like and engage with the activity. So these are things like priming, intermittent reinforcement, which is also associated with randomness and information asymmetry. So these kind of activities change people's behavior. So can we also then use these strategies to also help people who play esports to change their health behaviors, including fundamental movement skill learning? One other aspect is to do with role modeling. I mean, see Tiger Woods here. So Tiger Woods really was the role model in golf for many golfers to change their physique, basically. Tiger introduced a lot of like the gym training and the physical training to golf. And I think if you look at the professional tour these days, there are very few golfers who look like this anymore. So can we have, for example, the elite esports, who most of them also have physical trainers and probably are well trained to act as role models for the people who play at a lower level to actually also strive for becoming more esport fit, for example. There are other esport benefits which are at the lower for everybody really. These are transferable cognitive skills. So one bugbear I'm trying to sort of develop in particular adolescents is what we call self-regulatory skills. And they've been shown to actually be helpful for success in sport as well, but also for be successful in education. So they can help you to behaviorally and emotionally actually to do better. It can help with what we call a growth mindset or cognitive flexibility. And again, like cognitive flexibility is an aspect of executive functioning. And again, this helps in people do better in educational context as well. And one other aspect is what we call positive youth development. There's a lot of literature within sport and exercise psychology that if you engage in or create physically and psychologically safe environments, the ability to develop relationship and belonging helps in the positive development of youth. I would like to mention just a couple of roadblocks which are problematic within esport. It's important to recognize that most esport organizations try to maximize their profits or make sure that their brand is the brand awareness. However, in order to enhance their legitimacy, they require transparent governments. So this would require independent and autonomous administrations or governmental recognition, which is happening to some extent, but not as much. But it also needs to be compliance with international regulations. For example, they would have to comply with WADA in terms of doping. There's definitely an increase in research awareness in esport. We've experienced ourselves, it becomes a bit harder to recruit participants for studies. One of the reasons might be due to that, particularly in gaming, the research has focused mainly on negative consequences, like physical and mental health issues. So maybe going forward, there will be also need to emphasize the potential for positive aspects and engagement in esport. It's also hard to get actually funding for esport research. There are very few funding bodies across the world who would sort of fund this type of work. And finally, there are ethical considerations. As indicated previously, there's a lot of young people involved in esport, and there's a need to protect them from exploitation. In addition, esport generates a lot of data, and it's unclear who actually owns what. And it's also likely that there will be corrupt practices within esport, and we need to be able to police that as well. This, for example, to do with betting, for example, and how it influences people's performance. Overall, I would like to think there are just the obstacles just said there's accelerated growth in esports, and it provides an opportunity for us to actually influence performance and the health behaviors, and often the health behaviors in those who are hard to reach. The organizational structure of esports still needs to be addressed, and I just wrote a book chapter on sort of how, for example, support structures might help elite athletes, for example, with psychological support and psychological safety. And we need to develop interventions to enhance esport performance and well-being, and it needs to be they need to be developed, and particularly in terms of interpersonal stresses and communication. And we probably need a bit of money to do this kind of work as well. That's that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Remco, for a fascinating presentation. I'll now open it for questions. Any immediate questions? If not, I'll ask one and let people get ready for their for their questions. What is the research regarding the physical activity profile of the elite versus sub-elite and the like? Do we know that?
There are some studies done, and actually, at the elite level in particular, the physical activity behaviors, it's the meet criteria, or I do more than that. Um, some study we done myself with Michael Trotter, we actually showed that the physical activity behavior in school children was the same for those who played esports and those who did not. So that's a promising findings, but more work needs to be done. And I mean, some of the past work is a bit sort of difficult to interpret because of what was seen as esports and non-esports. So often people like gamers and esports, people are sort of put on the same. So, but we really have to distinguish between what's esport and what's gaming.
Yeah.
But we have been working with some of the schools, particularly when I was in Queensland, and they're all keen to sort of work and because basically the kids want esport clubs, but the schools wanted also make sure that they actually do enough physical activity. So I think there was this demand from both sides that the schools, yeah, will make it happen, but by the same token also want the kids to move and do other stuff.
Any other
And
questions? Nothing in the chat just yet.
there's just one. All the professional teams have like physical fitness trainers, sports psychologists, nutritionists. So I mean they're massive and they all support their team.
Do you see a great growth in being able to make the connection between the disengaged youth that are disengaging from regular physical activity to actually enable a catalyst into regular physical activity through the use of esports?
That's my vision of that. I really would like to that explore and research. I do think that say the elite esport athletes can actually help you as role models because again, like a lot of them actually do say that they have to train physically in order to get to that level. So I think if you can sort of make that link, then that might be helpful in doing it. It will take a bit of work, but I do think that you can actually get to these disengaged youth to do it. It also might help in creating the sort of in the mental health aspect in terms of create a sense of belonging because that's often missing as well and causes quite a lot of mental health issues. So um, and that's also to do with the way esport is organized. So often people who play esport actually want to become part of a club and talk to people, and often that's not possible yet. So I think the way we organize is like you're a member of a footy club or a soccer team. In esport is a bit more tricky. Often people do play from home rather than go to a club to do so. And so when I was at QUT, we set up this esport team. We built an arena, and you really saw that people want to be there. They want to talk to each other. They want to be coached. They want to talk about the game. And I think those things need to be developed over time.
So do you see like we build a football oval or a basketball stadium, we need to build an esport venue for.
We do, yeah. And maybe preferably next to the gym or on top of the gym or next to some other sporting organization. So that maybe at the same time they play some esport and afterwards they go and do some exercise. So integrated together, like it's sort of like a European model of how sporting facilities are often like multiple sports at one venue.
Yeah, I was intrigued about the coping with teammates performance as one of the key stresses at the elite level. And I know obviously in team sports, generally for general physical activity, they generally have the ability to engage directly with each other after the game to deal with their stresses in whatever way, shape, or form, sometimes healthy in a healthy manner, sometimes in an unhealthy manner.
I mean, I suppose what happens, you sit on the stage with your teammates, you basically have headphones on when you talk to it. So it's the I think the fact that you can't do anything about it at the time because one of your teammates might say something you totally disagree with. So you can't start arguing during the game itself because it's so fast paced. So I think that's where some of the issues arise, and I think particular sports psychologists can help actually here in improving communication styles and create some acceptance, and that's often a problem. The whole esport culture also still has this really toxic environment where people make online comments about people, which really has to change. And I think it's sort of that's part and parcel of the esport culture as well, which probably needs a bit of attention.
Okay. Does that filter down through the levels?
Yes.
哎，你这个可以吗？这，对对，
No, it wasn't a question. Um, so is there a role you see in and getting the balance right in esports versus gaming in maybe potentially the older population, where you're balancing off the potential negative effects of gaming, but you can get the positive effects of the esport?
It's a good question. I mean, in some way, and the people get older, you get this sort of change over time anyway, but that will take 10, 20 years. So it's, I think it's the realization that really, like, if you want to get good at this, you need to be physically fit, really. So I think that's an important issue. And that, I mean, the good thing with esport is often at the beginning and the end, and it takes a certain amount of time. Whereas gaming is sort of people can just continue for hours on end. So I think that's an important difference. Also, we have to get often esport teams do a lot of training, a lot of hours practicing, and not all the time is used effectively. I mean, just playing doesn't make senior any better. We need to think about other ways of how you can actually get better at esports, like we do for other sports. And often, actually, you need to sleep because you need to consolidate your information in memory. You actually need to get good diet. You need to get fit in order to make that happen as well. So, hopefully, this realization that there's lots of factors associated with playing well, and that's not just in your esports, but they can transfer to other parts of your life as well in terms of cognitive function in your work, for example.
So one final question, if there's none others. The personality traits of esport players at the elite level, are they similar to the personality traits that you see in top regular sports?
Actually, the work hasn't been done really. So we did look at mental toughness, and we definitely saw that people at the elite level showed higher levels of mental toughness. So in that sense, that's similar. I think one study done looking at some of the what's called the Big Five, and that was very similar as well. So you would expect it to be similar outcomes there as well, to be honest. But the thing with esport as well, it does allow, for example, people who have higher levels of what's called neuroticism, and they often find it hard to work with other people, so they can actually still sit in the bedroom and play. So in some way, there's more opportunities for them to engage in also at higher levels to do so. I mean, this is you're probably not aware of. So most of the top teams play together and they form teams, but at the lower level, even just below, what happens is if you play these games, you basically being allocated people to play with. And that's often why some of these issues arise as well in terms of your teammates, because you only play with them once and people just might say things you would never otherwise say. So, and again, like this is the way that I think we need to develop esport clubs where people can actually play with similar people over time and actually learn them to know each other a bit better and communicate in a better way.
And clearly, if it's going to be an Olympic sport, I suppose we'll see some of that harnessing of talent and progressing into camps and the like as we go.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm mindful of the time. We've just clicked over the 1 hour. I'd like to thank Professor Remco Pullman for his fascinating presentation and background on esports athletes. And clearly there's a big emergence in this field of research, and no doubt we'll see more and more papers coming out in that field. So thank you, Professor Pullman, for your time.
No worries. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.